شكرا.
Thank you, Mr. President. We welcome the distinguished delegation of India to the fourth cycle of the UPR. We commend India's commitment to achieve comprehensive, equitable, and sustainable development through the adoption of an approach based on the realization of the right to development. As the challenges of poverty continue, India continues its efforts to eradicate and alleviate it through a multifaceted strategy and the expansion of social protection programs, thus recording tangible progress in the implementation of the first Sustainable Development Goal. Our recommendations. We recommend India to take adequate steps to implement and evaluate rural development programs in order to ensure that these benefit the rural poor, in particular women and children. Second, to continue to strengthen measures to increase livelihood opportunities, especially for women empowerment, and to address rural poverty. I thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Tajikistan has the floor.
Mr. President, Republic of Tajikistan thanks the esteemed delegation of India for the comprehensive presentation of the national report and for the efforts made to implement the previous recommendations. We welcome India's strong commitment to address water-related issues on a priority basis, including implementation of the Water is Life program for achieving a universal access to safe and adequate drinking water by 2024. Tajikistan also appreciates the measures taken by India to ensure the promotion and protection of rights of persons with disabilities and to promote an inclusive and sustainable approach as well. In constructive spirit, my delegation would like to recommend the following. Further strengthen the efforts to support inclusive economic growth through sustainable utilization of available natural resources and to take further adequate steps to implement the rural development programs aimed to support vulnerable groups, in particular men and women and children. We wish the delegation of India every success in today's review. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Thailand.
Thank you. Thailand, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thailand welcomes the Solicitor General of India, Mr. Tushar Mehta, leading the Indian delegation to this UPR session. Thailand commends India for using digital technology to advance promotion and protection of human rights, especially in the universal health coverage and poverty eradication for vulnerable groups. Thailand notes India's endeavors to align its policies and practices with UN guiding principles on BHR. We recommend that India expedite the conclusion of the draft National Action Plan on BHR and further engage with stakeholders to guarantee its meaningful implementation. We also recommend India to intensify its effort to ensure free, compulsory, and quality education to all children, in particular children in vulnerable situations. And we wish India a successful review. I thank you.
Thank you. Timor-Leste.
Timor-Leste, please.
Senhor Presidente, Timor-Leste welcomes the progress made by India on human rights since its last UPR, including the establishment of the Ministry for Water Conservation and Management and policies to ensure universal access to safe and adequate drinking water, the adoption of the amendments to the Maternity Benefit Act, the Child Labour Act, and the Children from Sexual Offences Act. Timor-Leste recommends that India strengthens efforts to ensure that the justice system adjudicates cases in a gender-sensitive manner, continues to invest in the public health workforce to prevent, prepare for, and respond to all types of health emergencies, including gender-based violence, and considers establishing a legislative framework that recognizes the human rights to water and sanitation, and that such legal recognition is harmonized. We wish India a very successful review. Thank you.
Thank you. Togo.
Togo has the floor. President, Togo commends the progress achieved by India since its previous UPR, in particular the granting of a constitutional status to the National Commission on Backward Castes, as well as the amendment of the law on the prevention of atrocities against scheduled castes, as well as positive action in favor of the most vulnerable groups of society. We would like to make the following recommendations. Firstly, to ratify the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Degrading or Inhumane Treatment and the optional protocol related thereto. Secondly, to ratify the optional protocol to the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And thirdly, to accede to the Convention on the Status of Refugees and to the Protocol on the Status of Refugees. Togo would like to conclude by wishing India a very successful UPR. Thank you.
Thank you. Tunisia,
Tunisia, please.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. يرحب وفد.
Thank you, President. A cordial welcome to the Indian delegation. We thank them for the national report. We would like to commend India's efforts to implement the recommendations received during the previous UPR cycle. We have the following recommendations to make. Firstly, to continue efforts aimed at achieving the SDGs and to fight against climate change. To continue efforts aimed at implementing national policies against child labour and against violence against children, and to continue efforts to improve school enrollment rates, equal opportunities, and to ensure adult learning as well. A very successful UPR to India. Thank you.
Thank you. Turkey,
please.
Mr. President, Turkey welcomes the delegation of India. We appreciate the efforts by India towards realization of sustainable development goals. We trust that India's commitment to inclusivity and protection of human rights for all individuals, including members of minority communities, would only strengthen its status and credibility as the world's largest secular democracy with diverse cultures. In this spirit, we recommend India to take effective measures to prevent, persecute, and remedy discrimination and violence against Muslims and other religious minorities, condemn and address hate speech against Muslims and other minorities, take further action to combat trafficking in persons, including finalizing and implementing the Trafficking in Persons Bill, ensure the right to food to vulnerable sections of the population, and continue implementing measures aimed at poverty alleviation, including for women. Finally, regretting that solid peace and cooperation has not taken root between India and Pakistan even 75 years after their independence, we wish for a fair and lasting peace in Kashmir. Thank you.
Thank you. Turkmenistan,
please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Turkmenistan extends its warm welcome to the distinguished delegation of India and thanks it for the detailed presentation of the human rights-related accomplishments. We welcome the significant role of the National Human Rights Commission of India in the promotion and protection of human rights in an inclusive manner. Turkmenistan commends the government of India for ongoing efforts to develop its business responsibility framework to provide an enabling environment for improved participation of businesses in securing basic rights of the citizens. Along with that, we would like to submit the following recommendation. 1. To further strengthen work of the task force for preparation of India's National Plan of Action on Human Rights. 2. To continue implementing measures on strengthening of healthcare infrastructure, housing facilities, as well as support system for people of dependent on agriculture. In conclusion, Turkmenistan wishes the government of India a successful implementation of UPR recommendations of the fourth cycle. I thank you.
Thank you.
Ukraine, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ukraine welcomes the delegation of India and thanks for the presentation of its national report. We welcome the adoption of multi-pronged strategy for poverty alleviation and operationalizing holistic measurement of poverty by developing national multidimensional poverty index. We encourage India to continue with further work and would like to recommend to review and make the amendments to all restrictive laws so it conforms with international law and its standards, to redouble their efforts to ratify the Convention Against Torture, to ratify the international human rights treaties and the relevant optional protocols to which India is not a party yet. Ukraine wishes India a successful review. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. The United Arab Emirates, please.
سيد الرئيس يرحب وفد بلادي بوفد.
Thank you, President. We would like to welcome the Indian delegation led by Mr. Tushamina. And we would like to commend India's efforts to strengthen its human rights system. We commend India's efforts to implement the development plan for children despite obstacles in practice and despite the COVID-19 pandemic. We have two recommendations to make. Firstly, to support initiatives aimed at ensuring free education up until the age of 14, and secondly, to continue efforts with a view to fighting against climate change in full respect of human rights. Every success to India. Thank you.
Thank you. United Kingdom, tiene la palabra.
Senor Presidente, and let me warmly welcome the Solicitor General and his colleagues here today, and let me thank India for its continued engagement with the UPR and welcome India's commitment to implement the Convention Against Torture. We urge India to ensure its existing laws against child labour, human trafficking and forced labour are fully implemented. We recommend in particular that it set out plans for the ratification and implementation of the Convention Against Torture, that it reinforce efforts to protect the rights of all minorities as enshrined in the Indian Constitution, and that it ensure progress in the implementation of the Protection of Children Against Sexual Offences Bill and enhance protective mechanisms for child victims. Thank you, and I didn't even mention the cricket.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. Tanzania, please.
The Republic of Tanzania congratulates India for the comprehensive national report and welcomes the update. We acknowledge the progress made by India towards achieving the development agenda and improve the lives of its people. We note the various measures taken in the education and health sectors. We recommend India to consider taking steps towards improving access to maternal health, as well as continue its efforts in implementing its comprehensive policies to ensure quality education for all children. We congratulate India for ensuring that more than 94% households have access to improved drinking water sources. We therefore recommend the government to continue to implement policies to increase access to safe and clean drinking water in rural areas.
Thank you. United States of America tiene la palabra.
The United States welcomes the distinguished Indian delegation. We share with India, the world's largest democracy, the values of democracy, free speech, pluralism, and tolerance. And we encourage India to continue striving toward those ideals in consultation with civil society. We recommend that India, 1, reduce the broad application of the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act and similar laws against human rights activists, journalists, and religious minorities. 2, ratify the Convention Against Torture and prosecute those responsible for human rights abuses. 3, improve the transparency of license adjudications related to Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, FCRA, and create easier pathways for NGOs to appeal adverse government decisions on FCRA licenses. Despite legal protections, discrimination and violence based on gender and religious affiliation persist. The application of anti-terror legislation has led to prolonged detentions of human rights defenders and activists, often on a pre-trial status. We wish the Indian delegation a successful UPRI. Thank you.
Thank you. Uruguay tiene la palabra.
Thank you. Uruguay, please. Thank you very much, President. Uruguay would like to welcome the delegation of India, whom we thank for the report. We commend their efforts, which, for instance, include the enactment of the law on the protection of the rights of transgender persons. Encouraged by this commitment, we have the following recommendations. Firstly, to increase the financial and human resources allocated to implementing the protection mechanisms for children and teenagers with a view to eradicating child labour and child marriage, as well as sexual exploitation. To adopt an effective framework for protecting human rights defenders and journalists, which would protect them against acts of persecution, intimidation or harassment. To continue efforts to implement the law on the protection of the rights of transgender persons. Finally, Uruguay wishes India a successful 4th UPR. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. Uzbekistan, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Uzbekistan welcomes the distinguished delegation of India for submitting the national report. We commend the efforts taken by the government of India to promote and protect economic, social and cultural rights of its people, as well as the adoption of strategy for poverty alleviation. Our delegation makes the following recommendations. First, take all necessary measures for strengthening the national human rights institutions within the framework of Paris principles. Second, continue further practical measures to protect and promote the rights of children and persons with disabilities. We wish distinguished delegation of India a successful review of the national report. I thank you.
Thank you.
Vanuatu, please.
Hello.
Thank you, Mr. President. Vanuatu welcomes the delegation of India and thanks them for their insightful presentation. While noting the positive efforts made by India in protection and promotion of human rights, Vanuatu would like to make the following recommendations. 1. Review and repeal the draft 2020 environmental impact assessment notification, and reverse the dilution of environmental land and mining laws to ensure a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. 2. Ratify or accede to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And 3. Extend standing invitation to all UN special procedures. Vanuatu wishes India a successful review. I thank you.
Thank you. Venezuela.
Venezuela has the floor via Zoom. Thank you, President. We welcome the distinguished delegation of India. We commend you on your success in implementing UPR recommendations, particularly those to raise the well-being of women and children, persons with disabilities and vulnerable communities. India's made significant progress in economic development and fighting poverty. Free health coverage is provided to over 500 million people, and efforts being made to take water to rural homes by 2024. We congratulate you and recommend that you consider taking extra measures to implement laws and existing policies to fight sex crimes against women and children, to strengthen your social programs to increase income-generating opportunities, particularly to empower women and to tackle rural poverty, and continue to strengthen policies to ensure that persons with disabilities can enjoy their rights in the framework of the Accessible India campaign. Thank you. I call on Vietnam.
We warmly welcome the delegation of India and thank them for the report today. We commend India's efforts and progress made in advancing human rights since the last UPR cycle. Vietnam makes the following recommendations to India. 1. Continue to strengthen measures for increasing lively opportunities and addressing rural poverty, especially for women empowerment. 2. Continue strengthening the legislation on prohibition of child marriage to eradicate child and forced marriage. 3. Continue its efforts to address negative impacts of climate change and develop relevant strategy for mitigating the impact of climate change on the effective enjoyment of human rights. We wish India every success. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Yemen.
I call on Yemen by video.
Mr. President, we would like to welcome the delegation of India, and we would like to voice our appreciation for the presentation and its details, in which we have reviewed all the achievements made by the government of India in the field of human rights. The government of India has adopted a multifaceted strategy in order to alleviate poverty using short and long-term initiatives. Also, India has committed itself to take categorical measures to combat trafficking in persons and to support the victims and protect them, including the implementation of the terms of the United Nations Convention on Organized Crime. We commend all the efforts made by India in the field of human rights, and we recommend India to continue working and making every effort so that a law against the trafficking in persons would be adopted, as well as providing assistance and prevention and the rehabilitation of the victims. Thank you.
Thank you. Zambia.
I call on Zambia.
Zambia welcomes the distinguished delegation of India to the fourth cycle of the UPR, thanks them for the comprehensive national report, and commends them for the establishment of the task force on preparation of a national plan of action on human rights. Zambia recommends the following. 1, prohibition of corporal punishment in schools. 2, provision of holistic and gender-sensitive support to victims and survivors of sexual violence from marginalized communities. And 3, prohibition of all forms of labor, child labor up to the age of 18. We wish India a successful review. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Algeria
has the floor.
Mr. President, Algeria warmly welcomes the distinguished delegation of India. We welcome India's commitment to reform its legal system with a view to protecting and promoting the rights of women and girls. We also commend India for undertaking proactive policies to address health, education, housing, poverty alleviation, food and social security. We would like to make the following recommendations. Firstly, pursue efforts to combat violence against women and children at the national and local levels through sustained improvement of services in public health centers, hospitals, and regional and technical units on the protection of women and children. Secondly, continue national efforts to realize social and economic development and eradicate poverty and achieve comprehensive sustainable development for all. We wish India a successful review cycle. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Angola.
I call on Angola.
Thank you, Mr. President. Angola welcomes the delegation of India to this cycle. We note that India has taken effective measures to strengthen its human rights framework while developing institutional infrastructure for the promotion of human rights. We particularly welcome the implementation of a comprehensive development strategy through accelerated economic growth and broader social safety nets with a special focus on vulnerable groups. Angola encouraged India to continue taking steps to protect and strengthen women's rights in all areas and recommends the following: to take concrete measures to protect the rights of religious minorities against all forms of violence and discrimination, to mainstream the fight against leprosy through poverty reduction programs, to consider ratifying the UN Convention Against Torture. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Argentina tiene la palabra.
I call on Argentina. President, Argentina congratulates India on implementing a number of programs for older persons during 2021. In addition, we have the following recommendations. 1. Adopt additional measures to ratify the International Convention for Protecting All Persons from Enforced Disappearance. 2. Revise and amend the law on protecting the rights of transgender persons from 2019 in order to allow official identity documents to be issued for these persons, including the adoption of measures to effectively prevent violence by institutions and police forces against trans persons. And 3, abolish the death penalty for all crimes and all circumstances by initially declaring a moratorium on executions. Thank you. Thank you. I call on Armenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Armenia warmly welcomes the distinguished delegation of India and thanks for the presentation of report. India is indeed the largest democracy in the world, whose remarkable progress and best practices we have been attentively studying. In the spirit of close cooperation, we recommend to continue prioritizing active work towards reduction of neonatal and maternal mortality rates, to further expand investment in the public health workforce, education and training, and given India's amazing IT achievements, to further address the gender and equity divide in digital education. We wish India every success and productive fourth review. I thank you.
Thank you. Australia.
I call on Australia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Australia welcomes India's efforts since 2017. In the interest of time, I'll just move straight to the recommendations. Australia recommends India, 1, ensure civil society is able to operate without interference by establishing grievance redressal and appellate processes to increase transparency and support the application of the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act. 2, establish a formal moratorium on the death penalty with a view to ratifying the second optional protocol to the ICCPR. 3, strengthen accountability measures by collecting and publishing data in a timely manner to enable objective monitoring and evaluation of human rights indicators. And 4, ratify the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and finalise the draft national policy for persons with disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you. Bahamas.
I call on Bahamas.
Mr. President, we thank the delegation of India for its report and commend progress made since the last review. In a constructive spirit, the Bahamas recommends that India, 1, accelerate efforts to ratify the UN Convention Against Torture, 2, scale up efforts to address food insecurity among women and poor and vulnerable children, including by tackling root causes, such as social norms, which contribute thereto, and 3, bring domestic legislation in line with the provisions of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We positively recognize efforts by India to promote a fair and inclusive society, including through its extensive food safety net programs, and commend the commitment of India to providing developmental assistance and capacity building to other countries and regions, such as the provision of vaccines during the pandemic, which benefited countries such as the Bahamas. We wish India a successful UPR. I thank you.
Thank you. Bahrain.
I call on Bahrain.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Kingdom of Bahrain welcomes the delegation of India and thanks them for their presentation. We welcome India's efforts to the promotion and protection of human rights since its last review, and we commend its initiatives during the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic and its efforts in addressing violence against women and girls. In spirit of the constructive cooperation, we offer the following recommendations. First, consider further efforts for rural infrastructure development with a view to eliminate poverty. Second, continue efforts to expand universal health coverage and ensure social security for all Indians. Third, continue efforts to combat trafficking in persons and support and protect victims. The Kingdom of Bahrain wishes India a successful review. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Bangladesh.
I call on Bangladesh.
Thank you, Mr. President. Bangladesh thanks the distinguished delegation of India for its comprehensive presentation. We congratulate India for its remarkable achievements in ensuring universal access to affordable health care and free education to children, improving nutrition, poverty eradication, despite the COVID-related challenges. We are happy to note Indian emphasis on equality and non-discrimination and its legislative initiatives to address human trafficking. We are confident and we expect that the Indian human rights situation will continue to match its democratic credentials. In this spirit, Bangladesh recommends India to intensify its efforts in implementing its comprehensive policies to ensure quality education for all children and improve access to safe and clean drinking water and sanitation. We wish India a successful review. I thank you.
Thank you. Belarus.
I call on Belarus.
Thank you, President. We welcome the distinguished delegation of India and we thank them for the presentation of the substantive national report. We note the broad range of human rights obligations of India and the significant progress achieved by the government to implement them. In particular, there has been improvement of legislation as well as better protection for vulnerable categories of the population and better access to education and medical services. We welcome the government's efforts and the specific outcomes achieved linked to the social security system population and efforts made to reduce violence against girls and children and more effective ways of fighting human trafficking. In the spirit of our constructive partnership, we would like to recommend the following: to continue work towards joining the international instruments in the field of human rights and to ratify them. We wish India every success. Thank you.
Thank you. Belgica.
I call on Belgium.
Thank you, Mr. President. Belgium welcomes the delegation of India and appreciates India's efforts in addressing violence against women. We are convinced that further progress can be achieved to address gender-based violence and support human rights defenders. Therefore, Belgium recommends India to 1. Remove the exception related to marital rape from the definition of rape in Section 375 of the Indian Penal Code. 2. Repeal or amend the Foreign Contribution Act 2020 to ensure the right to freedom of association in line with the ICCPR. 3. Repeal or revise the Penal Code as well as the Unlawful Activities Act to ensure the right to freedom of expression in conformity with the ICCPR. 4. Withdraw the Armed Forces Act 1958 and 1990 from the districts where it remains fully or partially in jurisdiction. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Benin.
I call on Benin. We thank India for presenting its national report, which highlights meaningful progress in human rights since the previous UPR cycle. Our delegation also hails progress in good governance, fighting poverty and environmental protection. Our recommendations: 1. Strengthen the combat against human trafficking and slavery, 2. Ratify the Convention Against Torture and its optional protocol, 3. Ratify the 2 optional protocols to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Benin wishes India every success in the review. Thank you. Thank you. I call on Bhutan.
Bhutan welcomes the concrete efforts made by India in implementing its human rights obligations, particularly those guided by its developmental agenda. Bhutan also welcomes the measure to mitigate the impact of the pandemic and applaud India's generosity in donating COVID vaccines to many countries during the crisis. Bhutan commends India's policy initiatives to address poverty through various poverty alleviation measures. We also note the measures taken such as amendment of the criminal law on sexual harassment, increased penalty for rape of girl child, and the setting up of health centers for victims of sexual offenses. We recommend the following: 1, to continue its efforts in addressing rural poverty, and 2, take further steps to combat sexual offense against women and children. We wish India every success in its review. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Botswana.
I call on Botswana.
Mr. President, we welcome the delegation of the Republic of India to the 4th cycle of the UPR process and thank them for their comprehensive national report. We note with appreciation that India supported both our recommendations submitted during their last review, which were to take all appropriate measures in the implementation of the 2015 Juvenile Justice Act to give children aged 18 years and below an opportunity for rehabilitation and to ratify the Convention Against Torture. However, we take note that the consideration of the latter remains outstanding. In that regard, Botswana recommends that India ratifies the optional protocol on the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. 2, ensures universal health care coverage and access for all persons with disabilities in rural and urban areas. We wish India a successful UPR outcome. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Brazil tiene la palabra.
Brazil has the floor.
Thank you. Brazil welcomes the delegation of India to the 4th cycle of the UPR. We appreciate India's commitments to seeking universal access to affordable health care for all, and in particular India's sense of responsibility and solidarity by sharing COVID vaccines and response products to more than 150 countries. We commend India for aligning the national voluntary guidelines on socio-economic and environmental responsibility of business with the UN principles and the SDGs. With a spirit of constructive dialogue, Brazil recommends India to strengthen efforts to implement labor laws, especially concerning informal workers and women workers, and to consider adopting regulations on the protection of persons that ensure the rights of freedom and expression and privacy in accordance with the existing international standards. We wish India a successful review.
Thank you. Brunei.
I call on Brunei Darussalam.
Thank you, Mr. President. Brunei thanks India for the presentation and welcomes the steps taken in implementing recommendations from the previous cycle. In particular, we commend India's commitment in the area of adequate housing through programs such as the NULM and Smart Cities Mission, which has reduced poverty and enabled its people to access gainful self-employment and skilled wage employment opportunities. However, we note with concern on the report of attacks on minority communities and instances of religious intolerance, violence, and discrimination. Mr. President, Brunei proposes the following recommendations. 1, to continue implementing various schemes and measures to ensure inclusive access to adequate housing and basic amenities. And 2, prioritize efforts to ensure that persons with disabilities are afforded the same right to education as all. We wish India a successful review. Thank you.
Thank you. Bulgaria.
I call on Bulgaria.
Thank you, President. Bulgaria warmly welcomes the distinguished delegation of India. We appreciate the reinforcement of the constitutional principles of equality and non-discrimination through various legislative, institutional and policy measures after the 3rd UPR cycle. Bulgaria applauds the successful implementation of poverty alleviation programs by the Indian government and commends India's progress in providing access to affordable health care for all and ensuring free and compulsory education for all children in the age of 6 to 14 years. We would like to make the following recommendations. 1, take further measures to promote women's participation in the workforce, including through equal pay, skills development, job retention during pregnancy and maternity, and return to work opportunities after maternity. 2, complete the review process to bring the legislation, policies and schemes for the protection of the rights of persons with disabilities in line with the provisions of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We wish the delegation of India a successful review. Gracias, Presidente.
Gracias, embajador.
Thank you, Ambassador. Burkina Faso has the floor by video. Thank you. We bid a warm welcome to the Indian delegation and thank it for presenting its national report. We applaud India's efforts to implement recommendations accepted during the previous UPR cycle, which have led to a drop in maternal mortality from 122 to 103 per 100,000 live births by 2019. Whilst we encourage India to pursue its efforts and in a spirit of constructive dialogue, we have the following recommendations. 1. To ensure access to water and sanitation services on an equal footing regardless of the place or status of residence. And 2. Strive to ensure that persons with disabilities have access to public services in an inclusive and non-discriminatory fashion, particularly in rural areas. We wish India a successful review. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. I call on Burundi. Thank you, President. The Burundian delegation welcomes the Indian delegation and congratulates it on accepted recommendations. We appreciate India's determination to promote human rights in all spheres of life. We recommend the following. 1. To pursue these efforts to improve the environment. Take measures to promote access to free education and health for all. Free education and affordable health for all. We wish India every success. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. I call on Cambodia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Cambodia recognizes India's ongoing efforts to review legislation and to undertake legal reforms in line with its commitment to international human rights obligations. Cambodia commends measures taken by India to implement recommendations in the adoption of its third UPR cycle. In the constructive spirit, Cambodia would like to put forward 2 recommendations. 1. Continue efforts and measures to increase safe and sustainable drinking water in rural areas and to improve sanitation coverage, especially for indigenous communities and most vulnerable groups. 2. Continue efforts to promote women's rights and to eliminate violence against women and girls through effective legislation and law enforcement measures. I wish the delegation of India every success in this review. I thank you.
Thank you. Cameroon.
I call on Cameroon. Thank you, President. The delegation of Cameroon congratulates India for its brilliant and informative report to the 41st session of the UPR. India has made a lot of progress. It's definitely on the up. We have the following recommendations. 1. To grant the highest level of priority to women's safety by making a commitment to eradicate all forms of discrimination against women and promoting their empowerment. 2. Pursue efforts to protect children from sexual exploitation, corporal punishment, child marriage and labour, and support victims of sexual crimes. 3. Pursue the protection of persons with disabilities. And 4. Continue efforts to integrate scheduled castes and tribes into the development process. We wish you every success in implementing the recommendations accepted. Thank you. I call on Canada.
Thank you, Mr. President. Canada welcomes the steps taken by India to improve economic and social rights for all, including women and girls. Canada recommends that India, 1, improve the enforcement of laws relating to sexual violence, investigating all acts of sexual violence, providing training to law enforcement officials on effective interventions, and expanding the definition of rape and sexual assault to include marital rape. Number 2, to protect freedom of religion by investigating all cases of religious violence and discrimination on religious grounds, including against Muslims, condemning these cases and sensitizing the public on religious tolerance. 3, strengthen media freedom by ensuring that all legislation, including the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, is compliant with India's international obligations under human rights law. And 4, address violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Thank you.
Gracias. Chile.
Thank you. I call on Chile. Thank you, President. We bid a cordial welcome to the Indian delegation and thank it for presenting its national report. In a constructive spirit, we recommend 1. Work towards ratifying the Convention Against Torture. 2. Consider taking measures to establish a moratorium on the death penalty, which will lead to its abolition. 3. Study measures to reduce discrimination against women, including training of law enforcement officers in protecting the victims of sexual violence. Lastly, we recognise India's progress towards equality and non-discrimination. We wish India every success in this 4th cycle of the UPR. Thank you. I call on China.
主席先生。
Thank you, President. The Chinese delegation has 3 recommendations for India. Firstly, continue to promote economic and social development on a sustainable basis which will allow all Indians to enjoy their human rights. 2, take measures to fight human trafficking. And 3, to pursue gender equality. We commend India on its progress in economic and social development and strengthening the coverage of social security. We do hope that India will have a successful review. Thank you.
Thank you. Congo tiene la palabra.
Congo has the floor. Congo welcomes the Indian delegation and congratulates it on the presentation of its national report. India has made a number of efforts to promote and protect human rights since the last cycle. Meaningful progress has been made in economic and social rights in particular, and especially when it comes to health and education. Furthermore, my country applauds India's commitment to human rights thanks to its funding of the Office of the High Commissioner. We have the constructive recommendations as follows: to fight against debt servitude by rigorously applying the 2016 law prohibiting it, to ratify the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment or punishment. Lastly, Congo wishes India every success in its UPR. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. Costa Rica has the floor. Thank you very much, President. Costa Rica thanks India for presenting its national report, and we have the following recommendations. 1, adopt a legal definition from the WHO on female genital mutilation, criminalise it, and implement a national plan to eradicate it. 2, establish 18 as the minimum age for marriage throughout the country. 3, develop an action plan to eradicate all forms of discrimination against Dalits and promote their integration in the private and public labour markets, promote the right to a clean, healthy environment in the Constitution, ensure freedom of expression, and remove obstacles to accessing information online, to extend the coverage of supplies of drinking water and sanitation. Thank you. Thank you. Côte d'Ivoire has the floor. I'm not sure if you're on Zoom or in the room. Thank you, President. Côte d'Ivoire thanks the Indian delegation for presenting its national report. We congratulate India on its activities to promote human rights through training provided to civil servants in human rights in general, and in particular on collective rights. We encourage the Indian authorities to pursue their efforts, and we have the following recommendations. 1, ratify the Convention on the Status of Refugees, and to speed up the prosecution of violence against women and have a health sector response to gender-based violence at all levels. Côte d'Ivoire wishes India every success in the review. Thank you. I call on Croatia.
Mr. President, Croatia welcomes the delegation of India and thanks them for their report. We welcome the government's efforts in improving overall human rights situation in the country. However, we are concerned about the use of death penalty in recent years. We encourage the government to take steps towards the moratorium on the use of death penalty and to ensure the respect of international standards that provide safeguards guaranteeing protection of the rights of those facing the death penalty. We have 3 recommendations. 1. Address structural disadvantages faced by marginalized communities in accessing education, including Christian community. 2. Decriminalize defamation and libel and strengthen an independent broadcast media authority. 3. Ratify the 2nd optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, aiming at the abolition of the death penalty. We wish the delegation of India a successful review session. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Cuba tiene la palabra.
Cuba is recognized. Thank you very much, Mr. President. We would like to extend a warm welcome to the delegation of India and to thank them for the presentation of the report. We acknowledge their commitment to the UPR review. We would like to recommend, first, continue making efforts in the effective implementation of the General Plan on the Rights of the Elderly so as to ensure their well-being and their rights. 2, to continue to strengthen the legal framework as well as public policies to mitigate poverty with a view to eradicating it, and along those lines to continue to give priority to the most vulnerable groups. We wish India every success in this review. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. Cyprus has the floor.
Mr. President, Cyprus welcomes the distinguished delegation from India and for the presentation of its report. Cyprus commends India for progress made since the last UPR cycle, including significant strides in poverty reduction. The Supreme Court's 2018 decriminalization of consensual adult same-sex relationship was a major step in mitigating discrimination. Cyprus wishes to recommend ratify the 1st and 2nd optional protocols to the ICCPR and the optional protocol to the ICESCR, enhance legal provisions combating discrimination against women and girls, continue efforts to effectively enforce environmental policies, organize campaigns and educational programs to raise awareness of the importance of cultural heritage in all its diversity. I thank you.
Thank you. República Checa.
Thank you. The Czech Republic has the floor.
The Czech Republic welcomes the delegation of India and appreciates the improvement of legal provisions upholding women's rights. We wish to recommend to recognize domestic workers in India's 4 labor codes and recognize their right to collective social security benefits. To introduce comprehensive sex education in the Indian school curriculum to increase the students' awareness, train teachers, and prepare information materials for families. To repeal the crimes of sedition and criminal defamation in the Indian Penal Code in order to be in line with international standards on freedom of expression. To enact and implement domestic legislation on the rights of persons belonging to national or ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities. Finally, to guarantee freedom of expression and carry out independent investigation of all cases of attacks on journalists, including arbitrary detention and intimidation, especially in Jammu and Kashmir. We wish India a successful review. Thank you.
Thank you. Último orador.
Thank you. And our last speaker is the Gambia through a video statement.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Republic of the Gambia warmly welcomes the distinguished delegation of India and thank them for their continued and constructive engagement with the UPR mechanism. Mr. President, the Gambia welcomes and takes note that the Constitution of India guarantees free and compulsory education of all children between the ages of 6 to 14 as a fundamental right. We equally take note and welcomes India's efforts towards ensuring that persons with disabilities are better protected to promote more inclusivity. Mr. President, while recognizing the efforts being put in place by the Government of India towards child protection, my delegation would like to make the following recommendations. 1. For India to strengthen its laws and implementation structure at all levels to eradicate all forms of child labor, child trafficking, and domestic violence against children. For India to ensure that the justice system is responsive to women and disabilities and guarantee their rights for privacy and safety, and I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Many thanks. Now we would like to give the floor to the Indian delegation for its final comments. Thank you.
Mr. President, Excellencies and distinguished delegates, let me take this opportunity to thank you all for your participation in India's 4th UPR. We have heard and taken careful note of your comments, queries, and recommendations. I have already responded to some of the issues raised by the member states during my previous intervention. I'll try to respond to as many remaining issues as possible within the limited time available. So far as the question concerning torture or enforced disappearance is concerned, let me underline that India condemns any form of torture and maintains an inviolable stand against arbitrary detention, torture, rape, or sexual violence by anyone. The Constitution of India guarantees to every person the right to life and personal liberty, which the Supreme Court of India has interpreted to include the right to live with dignity. India is a signatory to the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, as well as International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances, and remains committed to ratifying the conventions. The 273rd report of the Law Commission of India has provided its recommendations on the implementation of convention along with the draft Prevention of Torture Bill. Since the subject falls under the concurrent list under our Constitution, the central government needs to take into account the opinion of states in this regard. The recommendation and the draft have been circulated to all the state governments and union territories for their comments. Further, the existing legal framework in India, such as provisions under the Constitution, Indian Penal Code, the Code of Criminal Procedure, among others, guarantees adequate protection against any form of arbitrary detention, torture, and cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. As a remedial measure against torture, courts in India have recognized victims' compensation, and in some instances, courts and the National Human Rights Commission have even directed payment of compensation, to which the state has duly complied. As regards the freedom of speech and opinion is concerned, the Constitution of India guarantees to every citizen the fundamental right to freedom of speech and expression. Like any other freedom, the freedom of speech and expression is not absolute in nature and is subject to reasonable restrictions in the interest of sovereignty and integrity of India, security of the state, friendly relations with the foreign state, public order, decency or morality, contempt of court, defamation, or incitement to an offence. As is evident, these restrictions are conceived to protect national and public interest and are required to meet a very high threshold. They are in consonance with Article 19, Sub-Article 3 of ICCPR. Being a fundamental right, any restriction imposed is amenable to judicial review by the constitutional courts in India, including by directly approaching the Supreme Court of India. Imposing reasonable restrictions enables the state to regulate freedom of speech and expression when it amounts to hate speech or leads to incitement to an offence. Nevertheless, it is a settled law in India that any restriction imposed must not be excessive or disproportionate. For instance, the Supreme Court in Shreya Singhal versus Union of India in the year 2015 struck down Section 66A of the Information Technology Act 2000 as vague, unconstitutional, and imposing unreasonable restriction on the freedom of speech and expression. So far as the Citizenship Amendment Act CAA 2019 is concerned, it is a limited and focused legislation which reaffirms India's commitment to the welfare of persecuted minorities in the region. This is similar to laws that exist elsewhere in defining specific criteria for citizenship pathways. The criteria defined here is specific to India and its neighborhood and takes into account the historical context and the current ground realities. It is aimed at enabling foreigners of 6 minority communities, namely Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, Jain, Parsi, and Christian community from 3 specified neighboring countries who have migrated to India owing to their religious persecution in those countries to obtain Indian citizenship. It will help in reducing their statelessness and would enable beneficiaries to have a more secured and dignified life. This act neither takes away citizenship of any Indian citizen, nor amends nor abridges any existing process for acquiring Indian citizenship by any foreigner of any country belonging to any faith or religion. So far as legislations concerning anti-terrorism and national security laws like UAPA are concerned, I would like to begin by saying that we have been facing terrorism from several decades. The state has a responsibility to protect its own citizens against the terrorist acts. We have enacted legislations like Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, Armed Forces within bracket Special Powers (over) Act, National Security Act to deal with the menace of terrorism and to protect the sovereignty, unity and integrity of India. These legislations have been enacted to secure a balance between the liberty of citizens and the security of the state. They have adequate safeguards inbuilt against any potential misuse. Operation of Armed Forces Special Powers Act is periodically reviewed by the Government of India after consultation with the state government concerned and the central agencies based upon the ground situation. Due to the improved security situation, the said act was withdrawn completely from the state of Tripura in May 2015, from the state of Meghalaya in April 2018. Further, in April 2022, it was withdrawn from 23 districts in Assam, partially from 7 districts in Nagaland and 6 districts in Manipur. These decisions are taken based upon the prevailing circumstances in each of the disturbed areas in order to protect the rights of the citizens. Mr. President, Excellencies and distinguished delegates, there were also observations, comments and recommendations related to key economic, social and cultural rights. India attaches high importance to implementation of these rights. Besides my opening remarks, brief statements made by representatives of various ministries of the Government of India have outlined the initiatives that we have taken to fulfill our obligations in respect of these rights, including our success in meeting sustainable development goals and creating an inclusive economy and society. Mr. President, our participation in UPR has been informed by our democratic spirit. My delegation from different ministries and departments of the government will be returning with renewed commitment and new ideas for further strengthening our institutional, legislative and administrative framework for better protection and promotion of human rights of our people. We are aware of the challenges but remain steadfast to realize this goal. I thank you for your participation and kind attention. I now invite our Vice Minister, Ministry of External Affairs, Mr. Sanjay Verma, for our closing remarks.
Thank you, sir. Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, on behalf of the delegation of India, I sincerely thank you for your constructive participation and engagement in our Universal Periodic Review. It is encouraging that a large number of member states took to the floor today. We found the entire exercise of preparation for and participation in the UPR useful. We have tried to respond to as many issues raised as possible within the limited time frame. We are thankful for your observations as well as recommendations. We will duly reflect on them in consultation with various stakeholders, including civil society organizations. We value your comments and recommendations, which should undoubtedly be taken into consideration by my government in delineating the next steps for further advancing the goal of protection of human rights of our people. India remains deeply committed to multilateralism, the UN Charter and its founding principles. In our tenure as a member of the Security Council, which comes to an end this year, we have acted as a bridge on some serious but divisive issues confronting the Council. As we begin the G20 presidency next month, we are sensitive to the challenges faced by developing countries. India will work with other G20 members to address serious issues of debt, of economic growth, food and energy security, and particularly of environment. The reform of governance of multilateral financial institutions will continue to be one of our core priorities. Let me conclude by reiterating that the Government of India's abiding commitment is for the promotion and protection of human rights of our people, including providing good governance and realizing the inclusive and sustainable development for the welfare of our people. As an ancient civilization which is reclaiming prominence, India suggests that diversity can coexist and prosper together. As the world's largest democracy, India is committed to the highest standards of human rights. Unlike my colleague from the UK, we have absolutely no reason today to refer to cricket, but I thank you again for participating in this UPR. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I would like to thank especially the delegation of India for all the work, the important high-level delegation that was here with us today. In the case of India being such an important country in size and population, as you said, a universal system that has a tool like this to address the human rights situation of such a big and populous country is indeed a very important tool for the world. So we thank the Indian delegation and also all the organizations in the country that I'm sure participated in the report and the follow-up of the recommendations. So agradezco la presentación.
I thank the delegation for the presentation and participation in the review. The reports will be prepared by the Troika, namely the representatives of Nepal, the Netherlands, and the Sudan. In accordance with the procedure implemented since 2015, the recommendations section is scheduled for distribution on Monday, the 14th of November at 6 p.m. And it will be considered for adoption on Wednesday, November 16th, as of 3:30 p.m. The full reports, including the summary section, will be circulated by email on Friday, November 25th, 2022. This brings us to the end of our meeting. We will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. for the review of Algeria. Speaking time will be 55 seconds for all. Inscribed speakers who wish to withdraw from the list are kindly invited to inform the Secretariat at least 30 minutes before the start of the review. I hereby close the 8th meeting of the 41st UPR Working Group session.